in this province. This government showed through their votes last night that in a small minority of cases, teachers will have to choose between shoving kids back in the closet or putting them in harm's way. Mr. Speaker, Saskatchewan people know that that simply is not right. And when all is said and done, this government, with their big majority, well, they're going to do what they wish. But Mr. Speaker, to the people of Saskatchewan, I say this: our fight does not end here today. In fact, Mr. Speaker, it's only begun. Hear. Yesterday, that Premier made it very clear he has no intention of changing course. He's not going to listen to all of the voices who have spoken out about this bill. He's not going to keep from moving forward, ramming forward with this bill. A bill that sows division and that puts vulnerable kids at risk. Mr. Speaker, at the end of the day, I guess that's his choice to make. And that's a choice that every member on that government side is going to have to make. But Mr. Speaker, the people of Saskatchewan will also have a choice to make about this time next year. They're going to choose between this team that has put in the work, that is listening, that is standing up for human rights, a team that is focused on the things that matter to Saskatchewan people, a team that knows that this is a province where we are better served, we are stronger together. Sure. On the other side, they're going to continue to see a government that is tired and out of touch, that are only listening to themselves, and that they have shown themselves to be willing to use children, vulnerable children, as political pawns. A government that plays on people's fears and actively sows division. But you know what, Mr. Speaker? I'm okay with those two choices. Because in Saskatchewan, we know this so clearly. Hope beats fear every single time. And with that, Mr. Speaker, I would ask all members to vote against this bill, and I will clearly be voting against this bill.
Recognize the member from Regina University.
Hear, hear. Hear, hear.
Thank you again, Mr. Speaker. Diversity, equality, respect. These are things that the people of Saskatchewan believe in. These are things that we used to think all members in this assembly believed in. Diversity, equality, respect. Inherent to the very values of this province, for many people, strength. And yet here we are, special sitting of the legislature. And it bears asking, Mr. Speaker, why are we here? On this side of the Assembly, Mr. Speaker, we know why we're here. And we have done everything we can. And we were clear from the outset. Unfortunately, perhaps tragically, We can't stop this bill from proceeding. We know that. Members opposite know that. The public knows that. And yet here we are. We're here to pass a piece of legislation, while the members opposite are, that will penalize a small minority, minority within a minority within a minority, that the courts of Saskatchewan have said will face irreparable harm from this piece of legislation. A small group 7 times more likely to experience self-harm or suicide, when the leading cause of death of young people in this province is suicide. Here we are, not to address that tragedy, not to fix that problem, but to pass a piece of legislation aimed at punching down on terrified, vulnerable children, a handful. And in order to do this, Mr. Speaker, this government, who was given a mandate by the people of Saskatchewan, has ambushed this province. There's no reason for us to be here doing this in a special, expensive sitting of the legislature, Mr. Speaker, and yet here we are. These aren't the type of things that should happen in a proud, accountable, transparent democracy, Mr. Speaker. These are the things that happen in a banana republic, not a mature democracy. They've changed the rules. They forced this ridiculous session, which for members opposite is just performative. Members of the opposition, the Saskatchewan New Democrats, we have been doing our job with integrity, with commitment, with dedication. I look at my colleagues on their feet for hours, making case after case, diverse cases, appealing to law, appealing to compassion, appealing to minority rights, appealing to people who should care about education, perhaps healthcare, or choking economy. And I think about the people of this province, Mr. Speaker, the many, countless who have engaged with sincerity, sharing stories that are hard to hear, let alone put down in words, with the bravery and the confidence to have them read on the floor of the Assembly of Saskatchewan. I know you've heard those stories, Mr. Speaker. I know members opposite have listened to those stories. And yet, here we are. And to the members opposite, I would say you have done everything you can, everything possible, to make this as performative and as humiliating and shameful an exercise as possible.
That's right.
And it's because you believe in your cause. They believe in their cause, Mr. Speaker. So let's take a visit. What is their cause? Because let's remember, this is a painful, hurtful, but ultimately ineffective exercise in democracy that we're engaged in right now, Mr. Speaker. They've changed the rules. They don't even have to stack the deck. We know what the balance of seats is in this legislature, Mr. Speaker. We know what the balance of power is. But there could still be some compassion. There could still be some integrity. Earlier this summer, Mr. Speaker, I had the good fortune to sit next to a Conservative member from New Brunswick on a bus. Just happened to sit down, and he introduced himself. He said, I'm an MLA from New Brunswick. I said, oh, I'm an MLA from Saskatchewan. I'm a New Democrat. He said, oh, I'm a Conservative. And I said, well, that's okay. I know some. He said, well, but I want to be really clear. This is a true story, Mr. Speaker. He said, I'm not one of those Conservatives.
Here.
I'm one of the members who stood up against Premier Blaine Higgs. I'm one of the members who spoke out.
Here, here.
So we know, Mr. Speaker, there's at least a few Conservatives with integrity left in this country, Mr. Speaker. There don't seem to be many left.
That's right.
In this Assembly, Mr. Speaker. This was a member, he represented what he described as the Bible Belt of New Brunswick. A very socially conservative province, Mr. Speaker, very traditional, a proud province. And yet this man, who'd been a cabinet minister, had the courage of his convictions, and he knew that this was wrong, and he knew it was the worst kind of politics. And I didn't ask, I was just gonna sit and chat nicely with this, this friendly gentleman sitting next to me. But it was important to him that I knew. And I think it's important that people know that despite political differences, we can and we should, and there are still people out there across the spectrum who believe in human rights, equality, and diversity. Not here, Mr. Speaker, because let's remember, there's no reason for this special sitting. We don't need to do this. Again, look at the desks. It's like 2.5 times more members on that side. They could pass this without this dangerous charade, Mr. Speaker. You don't need to use the notwithstanding clause unless there's some secret deadline between October 20th, which I think is today, it's been a long week, and October 25th. What was going to happen this weekend? You could have done this next week. Could have saved possibly hundreds of thousands of dollars, maybe millions. I have no idea how much this special sitting is going to cost in dollars and cents, but I know what it has cost in integrity, and I know what it has cost in the suffering for a minority of people in this province, Mr. Speaker. Right. And again, this is a dangerous charade, and it is a charade not because what we do in this Assembly doesn't matter, it does. But it is a dangerous charade because there was no reason for it. It is theater to serve some end of the members opposite. We've been here for nearly 40 hours, Mr. Speaker. 40 hours of debate. And they're not listening. They're sitting there. We've seen it reported. Airbuds in, Succession playing, maybe Lord of the Rings, depending on what time of day it is, Mr. Speaker. Novels out, airbuds in. They're not listening. And they could have just forced this on the province, or they could have had the courage of their convictions, Mr. Speaker. Go seek a mandate. You could have stood up on Wednesday and led with this in your speech from the throne. Again, unless perhaps there's some secret deadline we're all working towards. You could have led your throne speech with this year's Sask first. Except this year it's kids last, which really puts Saskatchewan last, Mr. Speaker. The members opposite could have had the courage of their convictions. They could have stood up, Mr. Speaker, whatever those convictions are. Love the sin or hate the sin. They could say the quiet part out loud, which they've tiptoed dangerously close to in this past week, Mr. Speaker, in the few minutes they've stood up and spoke. Except now, Mr. Speaker, it's not just love the sinner, hate the sin. It's penalize the sinner. Except now, according to what's been put forward by the members opposite, it's the children who are problematic, the children who are sinful. Except we know, Mr. Speaker, children aren't sinful. They are born perfect, just the way they are.
Here, here.
Being gay, being trans, questioning your identity, it's not a sin. It's not a sin you choose to live with. It's not something you lean into. It's who you are, Mr. Speaker, for many people, strength. Children are not born broken or flawed. So say the quiet part out loud, Mr. Speaker. Have the courage of your convictions. But the members opposite, they think that those children, gender, sexually diverse people, people who don't fit the mold of what they think Saskatchewan should look like, they think those people should be quiet. Perhaps they should go away. Perhaps they should move. Perhaps those are the people they don't mind leaving this province. Because again, we've heard it through dog whistles, through whispers, even in comments made last night by the Minister of Justice. It's, we have to, I'm going to paraphrase, rewrite the balance of what's happening in schools, what's happening out there. Where are all these trans kids coming from, Mr. Speaker? My words. Maybe it's the internet. Maybe it's the teachers. Maybe they've been here all along.
You're here.
But that's not what these members believe, Mr. Speaker. And I would challenge them. If you think it's a choice, if you have the courage of your convictions, if you think it's a sin, if you think it's wrong, if you think it's misguided, stand up and say it out loud.
Stand up.
Lead for the people you are so desperately seeking approval from. But they won't, Mr. Speaker, and it is cowardly, and it is dangerous, and it's a shame. Unfortunately, it is now our shame here in Saskatchewan. Mr. Speaker, as I said, we've done everything that we can on this side of the House, and we knew from the start we would not be able to stop this. We've done everything we can, and the members opposite have not done the bare minimum. Listening, accountability, respect for democratic institutions, respect for this magnificent building we are all privileged to have earned a seat in, to represent this province, to build it, make it better. Leave it better than you found it, Mr. Speaker. A commitment to transparency. But again, they won't say it out loud. They don't have that courage of their convictions. They're not quite brave enough to say that quiet part out loud. But we know where you're at. We see where you're sitting, all of you. We see how you're voting. And we know what this is truly about, even this show trial here today. Mr. Speaker, the Education Minister last night, he talked about consultation. He talked about accountability. He talked about how the election in 2020 was part of that consultation. But he can't produce any evidence that this is something he's heard. He can't produce a shred of substantive proof that this has been heard across the province. And to the members opposite who sit by virtue in agreement with that Minister for Education, who says that the 2020 election was part of the consultation done on this. I don't remember you running on this. Mr. Speaker. Even in last year's throne speech, which was something else, we didn't see any evidence of this, Mr. Speaker, even with the constantly changing narrative on the other side, Mr. Speaker. We see no evidence of anything except what has been provided to the courts by the Saskatchewan Party government, the courts which have a higher standard than the floor of this Assembly.
Right.
And all we know for certain is that this was undertaken on August 10th. Whether under duress, inspiration, but this isn't something that they've consulted on, Mr. Speaker. August 10th, and again, if we're working towards some secret deadline, Mr. Speaker, there's some reason this had to happen before October 25th. To the members opposite, to the Premier, Mr. Speaker, bring it on. Because we know where we stand, Mr. Speaker, and the people of the province see this, and they see your record. Shuttered hospitals, healthcare, underwater. No one in this province can find a family doctor, Mr. Speaker. They're closing emergency rooms. There are people in ERs, small communities across this province, emergency rooms, ICUs that do not have a doctor. The record of this government, Mr. Speaker, 4 to 7 years with negative economic growth, Mr. Speaker, an economy that has done worse under that Premier's leadership than every other jurisdiction in Canada except for Newfoundland. An economy that is doing 10% worse than it was in 2012, Mr. Speaker. Since 2018, fallen by 7.7%, nearly 8%, Mr. Speaker. That's your record. And now not only, Mr. Speaker, do the members opposite have the worst economic record in Canada, except for Newfoundland and Labrador, Mr. Speaker, they also have the dubious distinction of one of the worst social records, Mr. Speaker, and we knew, tragically, they already led there: infant mortality, hungry children, homelessness. It almost begs the question, Mr. Speaker, whether their policies and priorities are unkind and uncaring, or whether they simply can't achieve good outcomes because of their terrible economic record. And Mr. Speaker, the people of this province no longer trust the members opposite. They no longer trust that this is a government who is operating for anyone but themselves, Mr. Speaker. And I would say, Mr. Speaker, it is worse than that, because we're actually used to members opposite putting their own interests at the fore. And that's fine, Mr. Speaker. They like each other more than they like us, and that's okay. I think we'd say the same over here. They used to be at least decent to each other, decent to the province. And we know this legislation is hurtful and damaging to this province, not just to that handful of terrified children out there, to adults who've lived through some of this trauma. It's harmful to our reputation. Again, we're making the New York Times, we've made The Economist, we've made The Guardian. How many times under this Premier's watch, and for what? Violating the human rights of children, inviting a convicted wife-beating murderer to this Assembly and then defending it for 5 days. The moral compass is askew, Mr. Speaker, but the members opposite at least used to be decent to each other, at least outwardly. And we know, you can look at the benches, and look at the voting records, Mr. Speaker. We know this isn't easy for all members opposite because it is not right. And to the members opposite who are struggling with this, it's good you should struggle with this, Mr. Speaker, because it's not the right thing to do. It's not the right thing to do for people in this province. It may not be the right thing to do for your family members, to your staff, the people who work in this building.
That's right.
But Mr. Speaker, even for a caucus, even for a government that used to put themselves, they put each other above all else. They're not even doing that, Mr. Speaker. It is an increasingly small, zealous circle that is putting their own beliefs at the forefront, and they don't even have the courage to come out and say it out loud. You know, Mr. Speaker, I'd come back to that question of trust. We certainly don't trust you. We haven't for a while. We fight elections about that every few years. And we don't believe you when you say you're putting the best interests of this province first, Mr. Speaker. And it's even harder when we see the changing narratives around this, Mr. Speaker. And on the side of common sense, on the side of common shared values, which is where we're situating ourselves, Mr. Speaker, there's a lack of trust, there's a lack of belief, because we know the record of members opposite. We know this isn't about protecting families. We know this isn't about children. It's about righting the balance, I believe, were the Justice Minister's words. What's happening with families and society and education. Justice Minister, Mr. Speaker, I would point out, had her shot at education.
Right.
And what did we see there, Mr. Speaker?
Witchcraft residents.
What did we see? We saw the Justice Minister take an opportunity, choose my words carefully, to elaborate on a homework assignment for the sole purpose of denigrating treaty education and reconciliation in this province.
Shameful.
Mr. Speaker, to throw teachers under the bus, Indigenous children, survivors. You know, Mr. Speaker, and again, it's not just education, and people in this province should pay attention. Because that minister had her kick at education, and a kick it was, Mr. Speaker, and now she's got her shot at justice, Mr. Speaker. And we've heard out there, this is about the rights of all Saskatchewan people. You know, if they're going after vulnerable, questioning children, who next? Mr. Speaker. And the Justice Minister has been quite clear. I'll read from an article in her own words, Mr. Speaker, which I'm happy to table in this Assembly, entitled Something to Talk About. And I'll quote, "Doesn't it simply make sense on every level, psychological, humanistic, legal, that while abortion should be available for the first trimester or so, more serious hurdles should be in place after that, considering what we know about fetal development and the rising survival rates of premature infants," end quote. What's coming next Mr. Speaker, from the same government who has done nothing to advance maternal health care, prenatal care, from the same government that has women in labor driving from Swift Current to Moose Jaw, the same government that cannot provide anesthesiologists for people who may need, let's say, worst case scenario, not who may choose, but who may need life-saving deliveries for them or their infants. You cannot get that, Mr. Speaker, under this government unless you're lucky enough to have an anesthesiologist in your town on that day. There's no note on the door of your hospital saying, whoops, sorry, hop in the car, drive 3 hours. And it is this government's record, Mr. Speaker. In 1986, there were over a dozen anesthesiologists in Prince Albert. And yet here we are with a justice minister who has signaled, who has put in her own writing, her own words, where this government might be going next. And then, Mr. Speaker, there's our new education minister, again, who strains belief. People in this province, they don't believe him because there's nothing to believe. The minister had 5 hours in committee last night to make his case with experts, with public servants, ready and waiting, Mr. Speaker. And what did we see? He couldn't do it. All we saw were the same tired, incompetent talking points. Mr. Speaker, the minister spent 5 odd hours condescending to the province about the things he's learned since August. And he could not come up with a good reason, a clear reason for this change. He couldn't make his own case. Mr. Speaker, the talking points aren't cutting it. And I don't know if it's overconfidence, a fervid, closely held belief in the actions he's undertaken on behalf of this government, on behalf of the people of the province who are not supportive, Mr. Speaker. But a word of advice to that new minister, so confident in all he's learned in the past couple years that he's been in this province, in the past couple months that he's held this job. If you're going to try and convince people of something that's maybe a bit of a stretch, it has to relate to things that they already kind of believe. And this minister can do nothing but stand up and say, the official opposition, Saskatchewan New Democrats and those like them, which, Mr. Speaker, is increasingly nearly 50% of this province self-identified. Those people hate children. Those people hate families. They don't care about families. Mr. Speaker, the members opposite have spent a heady 16 years just hammering away, trying to convince the people of the province that the only folks who care about this economy, which again has shrunk under their watch, the only people who care about natural resources, who care about jobs, who care about fiscal responsibility are the members opposite. That well has run dry, Mr. Speaker. People of this province have finally had enough. People of this province can see the lack of economic activities. They can see how much their grocery bill costs. They can see their wages are stagnant, Mr. Speaker. They can see the PST added to every fun thing they try and do in this province every pair of pants they buy to put on their kids, Mr. Speaker, every time they go out, spend a little bit of money in the economy, they can see the impact that this government is having on their lives. That well has run dry. So what are they trying to do now, Mr. Speaker? They're trying to convince this province that half of their neighbors hate families, don't care about kids. Mr. Speaker, I can speak for members on this side. We're sick of identity politics. I've said it before, it's the economy, stupid. Let's talk about cost of living. Let's talk about health care. Let's talk about the public services that are intrinsic, the basic needs of this province that you are failing to deliver on. The only people who want to talk about trans issues, about queer kids, are the members opposite. Make no mistake, Mr. Speaker, we will stand up and we will defend human rights any day of the week. But what we see is the increasingly calculated, desperate, thirsty grasping of members opposite as they try and convince the province that this caucus, who's had, what, 4 babies on the side of the legislature? 5? He's probably had 5 babies. Apologize to my son, I forget he's around sometimes. Probably got, what, like 30 kids between us? They're trying to convince the people of the province, Mr. Speaker, the working parents on this side of the House don't care about families and are out of touch with the realities. It's a bold play, Mr. Speaker. Let's see how it pans out.
Hear, hear.
And to the Minister for Education, I'd remind him, if you're going to try and convince people of something, they should already believe it a little bit. And I know the people of this province do not believe that their neighbors hate families, hate parents. People of this province are better than that. Common values, common sense.
That's right.
Mr. Speaker, his own talking points, his smugness has left him twisting in the wind, speaking down to a province. Because this room, these committees, these are accountability measures, Mr. Speaker. These are democratic institutions. And they matter, Mr. Speaker. And it is a humiliation, not for just that member, not for the minister, but it is a humiliation for this province and for our institutions and for our proud history. Leave it better than you found it, Mr. Speaker. Well, nobody believes that the members opposite are interested in doing that. Nobody believes that the members opposite care about children, Mr. Speaker, in education, keeping kids safe. Nobody believes that, Mr. Speaker. And there's a very clear example of this, Mr. Speaker. Legacy Christian. We've seen schools, Mr. Speaker, in this province with actual documented abuse.
That's right.
Criminal charges, Mr. Speaker, for sexual interference with minors. Actual groomers in schools in Saskatchewan. And what did that self-righteous government do? They turned around and they increased their funding.
That's right. That's right. That's right.
Mr. Speaker, you raised their funding. When presented with clear evidence of actual child abuse in schools, didn't even respond to the emails.
That's right.
Not tens of thousands of emails, Mr. Speaker, which maybe get overwhelming, especially if they're from registered hate groups, but emails saying, hey, this happened, I'm concerned about this. They turn around, they raise their funding, Mr. Speaker, at schools with documented child abuse, sexual abuse of children. That is the record of this government, Mr. Speaker. So I would say look at the records, Mr. Speaker, look at the benches in this Assembly and look at the issues raised and the integrity of the work, Mr. Speaker. And I have confidence in the people of this province, Mr. Speaker. So those of us, Mr. Speaker, the majority of people of this province who are on the side of common sense, common values, who care about families and children and parents being engaged in education, we don't believe the members opposite who can't even get their own stories straight around a cabinet table. Don't believe they're on the side of decency, Mr. Speaker, of common sense. And that might be okay for members opposite. But even, Mr. Speaker, on the far sides of the fringe, the people for whom that government is so desperate for adoration, well, they don't believe them either, Mr. Speaker. This is a premier who recalled the legislature 2 weeks early, spending untold public dollars for this show trial. 2 weeks of show trials for a policy to solve a problem that, by his own admission, doesn't exist. And last night, the Premier, members of his cabinet, can't be bothered to show up and vote for that bill to proceed to the floor of this Assembly. Mr. Speaker, there's a prioritization. I apologize, Mr. Speaker. Apologize and withdraw. There's a prioritization, Mr. Speaker, of the needs of that government, Mr. Speaker, putting in place the priority of fundraising, Mr. Speaker, building up that war chest, Mr. Speaker.
Waking up.
Instead of a government that, in solidarity, prioritizes this legislation. That far fringe, Mr. Speaker, sees that too. Mr. Speaker, they see that this is a government that prioritizes their own needs over these values, Mr. Speaker. Those people, again, whose adoration and acceptance you are so hungry for, they're paying attention. They're not stupid either, Mr. Speaker. People of Saskatchewan are not dumb.
That's right.
They care. We can solve any problem we put our minds to, Mr. Speaker. And they see that the members opposite care about shoring up their own fortress. You know, sitting in the keep of that castle, hoarding treasure, is the priority over going on the attack or stopping the moderate, principled members who have stood with them from jumping over the ramparts, figuratively leaping. So let's be clear, Mr. Speaker. The side of common sense, on the side of culture wars, no one believes in this priority, Mr. Speaker. Nobody believes that this is a true, necessary priority for this government. And we used to care, Mr. Speaker, about building this province. And we can look back, Mr. Speaker, through the history of this province and see what we've built, what we believed collectively until August 22nd, perhaps what we took for granted. It's common beliefs, achieved by unanimous votes in this Assembly. You know, Mr. Speaker, I read some words yesterday from 2014 from the now Minister of Advanced Education, when transgender rights were brought forward to be protected in the Saskatchewan Human Rights Code, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to quote again to really underscore the cognitive dissonance with which we're all sitting. And I'll quote, Mr. Speaker, as I conclude, let me repeat the words that I have said in this chamber previously. In Saskatchewan, our law recognizes the inherent dignity and equal and inalienable rights of all members of the human family. We do this as a province because the causes for which we stand of justice, of freedom, and of fairness cannot flourish where discrimination is given rein to coexist. This bill will maintain our position as a leader in protecting human rights and ensure that Saskatchewan remains a safe and welcoming province for all. End quote. Mr. Speaker. And here we are today. Mr. Speaker, when human rights were first brought to Saskatchewan in 1947, there was an understanding that they might evolve, that they would evolve, Mr. Speaker, that they should evolve. Because people are important, Mr. Speaker. The freedoms of people in this province are important. And now we have a government that, for nothing but perhaps a closely held belief that they are not courageous enough to say out loud, or their own shameful political calculus, is walking us back, Mr. Speaker, to before 1947. And you know, Mr. Speaker, I'm fighting against my urge to continue to read from Hansard from 1947, not just because of the eloquence that those members brought on both sides, not just because it's a proud part of our history, and not just to have those words echo once more through this building. But Mr. Speaker, because in 1947, the members of this Assembly were somehow more progressive on both sides when it came to understanding human rights legislation, Mr. Speaker. And I'll quote the former member, I believe from Capel-Wolsey, don't know if I'm allowed to say his name if it was in 1947, Brocklebank, Mr. Speaker, and I'll quote, I think that we will be able in the future probably to go farther, to make a broader and greater statement on the freedoms and liberties which we regard as our heritage. But I want the people of this province to remember this, that if they are going to retain their freedom, then they must be forever on their guard. End quote. And I said this, Mr. Speaker, eternal vigilance is the price of freedom. And these are members who are taking us back. It's a regression, Mr. Speaker, and not just the economic regression that we've seen under members opposite. A social regression, Mr. Speaker, a regression of rights, which is a wild choice to make as your legacy as a government. Because let's not forget, Mr. Speaker, this is a choice. There's no urgency. The Premier himself could not say outside of this assembly that there was any evidence that this had happened in the province, Mr. Speaker. The Justice Minister has nothing but a vague and entirely ominous allusion to a rebalancing of rights. Mr. Speaker, we've already canvassed what that agenda may be. And the Education Minister has nothing but a few talking points and a desperate plea he believes clever to people of the province to believe that their neighbours hate families and don't care about kids. It's a regression in decency, and it damages our reputation, Mr. Speaker, not just in The Economist, not just in The Guardian, not just in the New York Times, not just in our local papers on Coffee Row, conversations at grocery stores and hockey rinks, Mr. Speaker. It is deeply damaging to the young people of this province, Mr. Speaker.
That's right.
I was stopped in a store the other day by a woman who wanted me to know how misguided this was, who had worked in education and knew the priorities in that sector, Mr. Speaker, knew about how deeply parents want to be involved in their children's education, Mr. Speaker. This is somebody who worked in homeschooling with families who are participating in a different way. This is somebody who knows the breadth of educational offerings in this province, who knows families in this province, Mr. Speaker. And you know what she told me? Her daughter has moved from this province, Mr. Speaker. And her daughter doesn't tell people she's from Saskatchewan because she doesn't want to have the conversation about what that means. That's awful, Mr. Speaker. And that's a true story. The members opposite don't need to believe it, but I know people in the province, unfortunately, are having conversations like that in grocery stores, at hockey rinks, coffee shops, with their own family, with their own children. And I wish, Mr. Speaker, I wish the members opposite would believe that these are real people, would believe that these are real stories. Not just this one, which is true, Mr. Speaker, but the letters that have been read by my colleagues. Those come from real people, Mr. Speaker. Those don't come from NDP activists. Those don't come from, some fervored shop with ChatGPT going in one computer and somebody frantically editing. These are real, earnest submissions made by people from communities across the province, maybe people who have never engaged with their democracy in this way, but people who cared so much that they said, share my story, share my words, Mr. Speaker. I've got a stack here that I'm likely not going to be able to read, but I will table in this assembly, Mr. Speaker, and I'd ask the members opposite to read them. These are people who've provided their names. Mr. Speaker, and this is just a sample of the letters that came into my office specifically. So I'd ask the members opposite to read those, to hear the voices that have been brought as coming from real flesh and blood people of this province, Mr. Speaker. And even outside of this special sitting, Mr. Speaker, we see members of the public come to this assembly with their concerns, which I've said again and I'll say before, Mr. Speaker, is no one's first choice. It's their last choice, Mr. Speaker, and it's a shame that it comes to that. No one should have to come to this building to bleed on the floor of the rotunda, to sit and weep in the galleries, to get the attention of their government, Mr. Speaker. But again, these are real people with stories that matter. These are people saying, these are our priorities. This is my non-binary child who died by suicide because there weren't ample supports. Mr. Speaker, these are the people of the province, Mr. Speaker, and we believe them. And I would beg the members opposite to believe them true. Because when it comes to this province, Mr. Speaker, we can do anything. Lougheed, Blakeney, Davis, they believed that the work that they did made a better Canada. It made us stronger. They were proud of the work that they had done together to build up this great nation, to enshrine and protect freedoms. Not to create opportunities for the values, for the beliefs, for the opportunity for vulnerable children to have their rights stripped away. Mr. Speaker, diversity, equality, respect. Those are things, Mr. Speaker, we used to believe we all agreed on in this assembly. Regardless of which side of the aisle we sat on, diversity, equality, respect, those were commonly held values, Mr. Speaker. Common sense. And yet here we are, Mr. Speaker. And I'd say it again. Eternal vigilance is the price of freedom, Mr. Speaker. If we believe in diversity, if we believe in equality of all people in this province, no matter how old they are, maybe they're under 16, maybe they've only ever lived under this government 16 years. Their rights, their opportunities to be their true selves, they matter as well, Mr. Speaker. We have the opportunity, Mr. Speaker, and we have the privilege to defend rights. I would hope that's something we all share. But what we should not do with this great privilege that all of us have in this assembly, no matter where you sit, because I believe it was Alan Blakeney who said, there are no bad seats in this building. We can protect rights, Mr. Speaker, and we should do no wrong. With that, Mr. Speaker, I will not be supporting this government's bill.
Recognize the Minister of Crown Investments Corporation.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Speaker, I'm pleased to rise to speak to third reading of this motion on the bill that was introduced so ably and capably by the Minister of Education. Mr. Speaker, it goes without saying that I am in full agreement with the Minister's decision to move what was previously provincial education policy from policy to legislation and to provide clarity in terms of the roles and rights of parents in our education system. Initially, these policies were announced in the summer prior to the return of school to provide the clarity and consistency to school divisions, teachers, parents, and students, as I said, prior to the school year beginning. However, as we know, that changed with the injunction that was granted at the end of September, and shortly after, the Premier affirmed the desire of the government to use all tools necessary and available to ensure the policy direction prevailed. Mr. Speaker, I would note that the extension of the number of sitting hours has allowed for 40 hours, nearly 40 hours now, of debate by members. Double the 20 hours of debate normally prescribed under the rules of the Chamber, and certainly more than the 1.5 hours spent on average by members of the opposition on bills introduced by the government. An extraordinary amount of time to debate a matter that in any other time would be considered ordinary or common sense, to give parents the right to parent their children, to be involved in their lives and more specifically their education. I, for one, have been encouraged to see, despite what you may read in the media or what you may hear from the members opposite, that the vast majority of people in this province, including parents, agree. Parental inclusion is a good thing, not something to run from. Members have had the ability over 40 hours to debate essentially policies that were already in place by practice or policy in many, if not most, school divisions. For example, has been pointed out by the Minister of Education, the requirement to notify parents when and in what manner sexual health education would be presented to students was already the standing policy in the majority of school divisions, either informing or, in the case of a number of divisions, requiring parental consent was already in place. But there was a lack of consistency in terms of whether it was parental information or parental consent or how much advance notice was given, or even if the onus was on the school or, in some cases, the onus was on the parent. But again, some version existed in the majority of school divisions, and yet no one suggested that irreparable harm was being caused. And so we created a provincial policy, in fact, taken word for word from one of our public school division's administrative policies. It is the government's belief that parents are partners in their children's education. As the Premier said, it must be the default position of the education system to involve parents. The default position must be one of parental inclusion, not exclusion. And I was pleased to see that a number of school divisions confirmed that this is in fact their policies and always has been. Northeast School Division is one example. And most recently, my home school division of Southeast Cornerstone School Division. In recent days, the Director of Education has had this to say, quote, "The majority of what seems to be included in the press release on this new legislation is either in the Education Act or is in policy as current practice." He went on to say, "I think the major difference appears to be the policy regarding pronouns and name changes for trans youth. We have always had a default position in this school division that parents should be involved regardless of age in these discussions." As I said, this has been the policy or practice for most divisions. With those opposing this bill, will they take the position, or would they take the position that these school divisions like Southeast Cornerstone have and continue to subject students to irreparable harm? The director continued by saying, "One of the first questions that asked by schools is, do your parents know? And if they don't, can we help you in having a conversation with them?" Keating clarified, "The only time we wouldn't have shared that information in the past is when there was a safety concern for the student." End quote. Which is exactly the policy that we announced this summer. The same policy deemed to be that of causing irreparable harm, but nobody has been accusing Southeast Cornerstone of irreparable harm. Mr. Speaker, while these are or have been the policies for most divisions, there has been a move underway to change that. I became aware of it last fall as students and teachers were returning to school for the new year, as one of our public divisions had introduced a new policy just prior to the summer break that would exclude parents when it came to names and pronouns should the student decide they didn't want their parents to know. And this was first brought to my attention by teachers who were not comfortable with this direction, who questioned their future employment if they decided not to sign saying that they would abide by that new policy. And as news of this new policy slowly filtered out, parents began to raise concerns not just about the single policy change, but the direction in which it was leading to. And so it was parents and teachers. Mr. Speaker, I know that this has been subject to most of the 40 hours of debate that's being proposed, which, by the way, is 40 more hours than was ever afforded to anyone when these policies quietly came into place. But I'll just say this, Mr. Speaker. Parents are partners in education, period. Kids exploring their identities do better when parents are involved. Mr. Speaker, the leader of the opposition on John Gormley's radio show said when it comes to kids not having a safe home, it's, quote, 1 in 1,000. So why wouldn't we develop policy and now legislation that speaks to the vast, vast majority, the 999 out of 1,000? That is inclusive of parents, while ensuring there are provisions for the one. The leader of the opposition apparently agrees with this, that it is the vast, vast, vast majority of parents who aren't a risk to their own children. So let's develop policy that, with that in mind, and not the straw man that we've been hearing about. Mr. Speaker, this policy and now proposed legislation is alive to the practicalities of life. School division policies that were in place to withhold the preferred name and pronoun of students were impractical. To think that the name and pronoun of a student without the knowledge of the parents used in the classroom, on the school bus, on the playground, and somehow wouldn't get back to the student's parents, it was unlikely, Mr. Speaker. And finally, this proposed legislation is a reminder that despite anyone's best intentions, one fact remains: children are children. And we from time to time are required to put in guardrails. This already happens in education policy. I would quote from a letter to the editor in the Regina Leader-Post, one that was critical of the government's legislation, particularly of allowing for the notification of sex ed, again, which existed in the majority of school divisions. The author of that letter closes by saying, and I quote, "Teenagers are going to have sex, with or without education about contraception. Parts of their brains governing judgment and impulse control aren't fully developed," end quote. To which I would reply, exactly. Apparently, the author of that letter didn't realize that her criticism actually helps to make the government's point. We are dealing with children who may not have the ability to fully appreciate or accurately perceive how their parents may respond. The answer must not be, how do we keep them away? It must always be, in the words of Keith Keating, do your parents know? And if they don't, can we help you in having a conversation with them? How else can we expect a parent to be able to support their child if the policy is to keep them away, especially when a child is going through an issue that may be of a magnitude that most cannot imagine? Mr. Speaker, I will conclude with this. During my time as Education Minister, I was very open with the fact that I had never been a school board trustee, nor was I a school teacher, but that I was the parent and am the parent of 3 children, 2 of whom are in the school system, and that what I wanted for my kids in terms of their education is what I would want for every child that I was responsible for, that they would develop the knowledge, the skills, and the character that would serve them well in life. When it comes to our 3 children, Amanda and I have a set of our own values and beliefs that we want to instill in them. And if you knew the entire list, I'm sure that there would be things that you'd agree with, and I'm sure that there would be some that you wouldn't, and that's fair. Raise your kids how you see fit, and we'll do likewise, if that's still allowed in today's world. But there is one thing that we hold tightly to that is not negotiable: that our 3 will know and understand regardless of who tries to tell them otherwise, that we don't keep secrets. That is a lesson, and lesson is far too pedestrian of a term. That is a lesson in our family that has been hard fought and hard won. And so, as Minister of Education, I could not support something for your family, or for your family that I could not abide by for my own. And so I will be supporting third reading. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Recognize the member from Regina Douglas Park.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Now, Mr. Speaker, we started this conversation last Thursday saying process matters. We still fully believe that process matters. And that conversation started when this government rammed through changes to the rules of procedure in this legislature to get this bill passed as quickly as they possibly could. That bill was introduced that day, 8 days ago, Mr. Speaker. This bill was introduced to the public 8 days ago. Now, members opposite can talk about how, well, they doubled the time for debate. Usually it's 20 hours. This time it's 40 hours. That was 8 days ago, and it would have been shorter had this government got their way on Thursday. What have we seen in these past 8 days, Mr. Speaker? Well, we've seen concerned statements from the Human Rights Commission, the resignation of a Human Rights Commissioner. We've seen statements from the Canadian Bar Association, Saskatchewan Trial Lawyers Association, the College of Law, many members of that faculty. Mr. Speaker, we have seen letters upon letters upon letters from youth, parents, teachers, allies, members of the public raising their concerns, asking this government, what are you doing? And why are you doing it so quickly? Mr. Speaker, we saw this gallery fill with kids. Mr. Speaker, queer youth and their allies who left their classrooms to come to their legislature to say, what are you doing and why are you doing it so quickly and why aren't you listening to us? Mr. Speaker, that was in 8 days. That's it. All of those voices in the maximum time this government has allowed for debate on this piece of legislation. And like I've said before, you know, debate is a loose term here in this province. You didn't see much of a back and forth. I mean, you've just seen one entry on third reading. We saw one entry on second reading that wasn't the Minister of Education, and that was it. This opposition has done the work. We knew full well we couldn't stop the passage of this bill. But every single day, the case was presented to this government about why this was the wrong decision, this was a bad decision, and this was a decision that was being made far too quickly, Mr. Speaker. And as a note to government members, if this special sitting was pitched to you as a way of really sticking it to the Sask NDP, really hurting us, you know, we're going to make it long hours, we're going to make them go for 40 hours rather than 20. I'll tell you what, this Sask NDP caucus, this official opposition has not been stronger, more resolved, more determined, more united than we are right now. So for that and only that, I say thank you.
That's right.
Now I'm going to read in one letter from one of my constituents, knowing I don't have enough time to read in all of the letters that I have received, but I do want to cede the floor to one of my constituents who is trans. And she has sent me a lot of emails over the past few weeks expressing how truly heartbroken she is about the decisions this government has made and what it means for her and her community. She said in this one in particular, quote, "It is October 10th. It is World Mental Health Day. The irony is not lost on me that the government of Saskatchewan is choosing this day specifically to make the mental health of a chosen minority worse. Scott Moe, Dustin Duncan, Jeremy Cockrell, and the rest of the Saskatchewan Party caucus, by attacking a small, vulnerable minority of children and wielding the power of the government to completely remove their human rights, specifically their rights to safety and dignity, will have a brutal and chilling effect on every transgender and gender-diverse person in Saskatchewan. By targeting transgender and gender-diverse children, Scott Moe and his government have signaled to their supporters and the province as a whole that abuse and attacks against transgender people is not only acceptable, it is a matter of government policy. When the government attacks any minority specifically, it creates a socially acceptable minority for abuse and attack. We saw this in a spike in racial violence against Chinese people, East Asian people, and Pacific Islanders when the former President of the United States called COVID-19 the, quote, China virus. When the government sets a tone, its supporters will follow. Scott Moe, Dustin Duncan, and Jeremy Cockrell will use the contents of 18 letters and create a policy over 9 days to attack and abuse transgender people across the province in a cynical ploy to distract from their poor record on housing the homeless, letting the healthcare system collapse during the height of the pandemic and the affordability crisis that everyone except the Premier and his party will have to suffer. This policy will make the province worse. The politics of this policy will make the province less safe, less inviting, and less worthy for a business to invest here, lest they be seen as agreeing with the government's desire to suspend the rights of a minority group because of 18 letters received in a province of over 1 million people. The Premier and his caucus have declared open season for attacks on transgender rights and transgender people in the province of Saskatchewan. They have deliberately chosen to make the province dangerous for transgender and gender-diverse people because a small minority told them to do it. That is scary. That makes the mental health of transgender people worse, and to do it on World Mental Health Day is a choice made by a group of people with only the worst of intentions for the province and its most vulnerable people, end quote. I'm going to read in another letter. This is from an individual who is a registered doctoral psychologist. Quote, "I am speaking both as a citizen and as a registered doctoral psychologist with over a decade of mental health training. I am deeply disturbed by the new bill requiring parental consent before children can be addressed by their pronouns and chosen name. I have tried to reach out to MLAs, cabinet ministers, and Scott Moe himself to discuss my concerns and provide my mental health expertise. Unfortunately, I have received little to no response. I am in touch with many psychologists across the province, and as far as I am aware, the Saskatchewan Party has not consulted with any of them to learn about the potential mental health implications of this policy. I believe it is my duty to speak up and shed some light on this matter. The state of mental health care in this province is devastating. On a regular basis, I hear firsthand accounts from individuals who have struggled to access appropriate mental health treatment. Every single person is affected by the gaps in mental health services, whether they themselves are struggling or whether they are watching a family member or friend struggle. But instead of focusing on improving mental health care, our government is choosing to put their time, energy, and resources into this bill, a bill that will actively harm the mental health of our province's children. I was going to start by providing a more detailed overview of the extensive body of scientific literature relevant to this new bill, but I think that's already been well established here. Studies consistently show that when trans and non-binary children do not have their identity affirmed, for example, when they are misgendered and called by their dead name, they are at an increased risk of negative mental health outcomes, including depression, anxiety, substance use, and suicide. This bill isn't just condoning the misgendering and dead naming of trans and non-binary youth, it is actively encouraging and, in fact, mandating it. The policy is clear. Teachers must misgender and dead name a child until parental consent is obtained to use the correct pronouns and name, no matter how long this process may take, and even where it is determined that it is not safe to seek parental consent. This means that the new bill is putting children at risk of mental health crises. So we know that this policy isn't based on science or reason, but I also want to go beyond the science and talk about the lived experiences of people most impacted by this policy. Since this bill was announced, I have had the opportunity to talk to a number of individuals about the negative toll that this bill is already taking on their mental health. Of course, trans and non-binary folks, including children, adolescents, and adults, are bearing the brunt of this. This is one of the most marginalized populations in our country. They experience discrimination on so many fronts and in so many forms. They are already at an increased risk of violence, suicide, and mental health concerns. And now, not only is their government failing to protect them, their government is actively working against them. I have also heard from gay, lesbian, and bisexual individuals who are deeply concerned for their trans and non-binary friends. They are also concerned for their own rights. They point out that if the government is targeting trans and non-binary folks, then one is to stop them from going after other members of the LGBTQ+ community. Take a look through the pages of history, and it is easy to understand where these fears come from. As recently as the 1980s, homosexuality, as it was then referred to, was classified as a mental disorder. It was viewed as something to be treated, or something to be punished, or something to be erased. Now, many of us look back on this chapter of history with horror, and yet it seems like the government hasn't learned from it. This bill, by its design, will erase trans and non-binary identities. With this bill, many trans and non-binary kids will end up punished for being who they are. Make no mistake, by enacting this bill, our government is writing a chapter in history that our country will look back on with horror. Scott Moe and other members of government will deny this, of course. They will claim that this bill isn't about targeting trans and non-binary folks. They will claim that it is about protecting parents' rights to be informed. It isn't. If it were simply about informing parents, then there would be no need to provide parents with veto power, to give parents the authority to deny their child's right to be called by their proper name and pronouns. If it were simply about informing parents, then this bill wouldn't just target trans and non-binary children, it would target any child who shares any significant matter with a teacher. For example, coming out as gay, changing religions, or bringing a date to the school dance. There are so many significant events that teachers are privy to, yet trans and non-binary children are the only ones having an entire bill enacted to give their parents veto power over how they are treated at school. Scott Moe and his followers will also claim that most parents will be supportive of their child's identity, and that being informed will bring families closer together. In a perfect world, that would be the case. But it isn't a perfect world. Not every parent will support their child. There will be those who try to stamp out their child's identity, maybe even going so far as to place them in conversion therapy, which unfortunately still exists, and which we know without a shadow of a doubt has truly horrifying mental health effects. Other parents will actually kick their child out of the home, which could lead to other disastrous effects for the child, including living in poverty, being unhoused, and being increasingly vulnerable to abuse. There is no way for teachers to know for sure whether it is safe for a student to come out to their parents. Teachers are not in the home, and children who are abused often do not disclose the abuse. I have asked members of this government to comment on whether there is a plan in place to help teachers predict whether it is safe for a child to come out to their family. No one has had an answer for this. Because there is no answer. It is not possible. Since there is no way to predict with absolute certainty which parents will and will not be supportive, I have also asked members of this government to comment on whether they have a plan in place to work with all families to increase support. This question, too, has gone unanswered. I assume I have not received a response because the government has no response to give. They have not thought through the policy enough to develop specific strategies to increase family support, nor have they considered the amount of time such strategies would take to implement, nor the fact that children would be at risk while they wait for the strategies to take effect. And even with appropriate supports in place, there will still be parents who do not support their child's identity. According to this bill, teachers are required to continue misgendering and deadnaming these children, no matter the cost to their mental health. This means that children must choose between the mental health effects and perhaps physical dangers of coming out in an unsupportive home environment, or the mental health effects of being misgendered and deadnamed at schools. Of course, many parents will be supportive when their child comes out as trans or non-binary. For these parents, there's absolutely no need for legislation mandating that their child be outed to them. The children of supportive parents will come out to their parents in their own time. Children are the best judges of whether their parents will be supportive and also of how they want to initiate that conversation. The Sask Party fails to acknowledge the damage that is done when an individual is outed against their will. Even if a child has a supportive family, we know how important it is for them to be able to come out on their own time and in their own way. This is true for gay, lesbian, bisexual, pansexual folks, and this is true for trans and non-binary folks. This bill will result in one of two things. Either trans and non-binary kids have to remain in the closet in all areas of their life, or they have to be outed to their families before they are ready. Both of these options have negative mental health outcomes. This bill has other implications even beyond the mental health effects. What about the implications when it comes to autonomy and consent? This policy is teaching kids that they should not have power over their own identities, their own lives, even their own bodies. As a woman, as a psychologist, and as a human being, I am not okay with this message. This message is not only implicit, but is explicit. The Sask Party's bill specifically says that children cannot receive sex education without the consent of their parents. Sex education has many purposes, but one of the most important is teaching kids about their right to make decisions about their own bodies and their right to set boundaries. And again, the bill is not just saying that parents must be informed, it is giving them veto power. That veto power creates risks for children of all gender identities, because all children can be exposed to the harms of sexual assault, unintended pregnancy, and sexually transmitted infections. It is especially horrifying to realize that children who are being sexually abused at home now cannot be taught about consent and healthy boundaries unless they first receive the consent of their abusers. As someone who works with survivors of sexual abuse on a daily basis, I cannot begin to express how devastating this is. Every parent, healthcare provider, community member, and voter has an interest in protecting kids from abuse. Again, the government may claim that this bill is about parental rights, but to the untrained eye and to my trained eye, it seems like this policy is just a way of keeping a lid on children's gender identity when it doesn't fit with what those in power are most comfortable with. And I simply cannot fathom how members of this government have convinced themselves that targeting trans and non-binary children is an appropriate use of the notwithstanding clause. I have heard many individuals who are not gender diverse state that they do not understand the experience of trans and non-binary individuals. It is clear that the people who created this policy do not understand the experiences of trans and non-binary individuals. Fortunately, it isn't necessary for them to understand. What is necessary is for them to listen to the voices of those who are directly impacted by this bill. Listen to trans and non-binary folks. It is also necessary for our government to consult with the experts, with those who have knowledge in mental health, in child development, in education, and in gender-based discrimination. Our government is not only neglecting to do this, they are passing this bill outside the normal legislative process that would allow experts and members of the public time to make their voices heard. Our government should be protecting its most marginalized citizens. They are failing these citizens. They are failing our children. They are failing LGBTQ+ communities. They are failing educators. And now, in trying to enact the notwithstanding clause, they are failing every single Saskatchewan citizen. This isn't democracy. It's the end of the letter. Now I hear the former Minister of Education's remarks that he gave prior to mine. And he said, and please understand that I'm paraphrasing, but he said that he acknowledges that this will affect the minority of children in our province. And he says, so why not pass legislation for the majority of our province? The majority of the children who won't be affected. Leaving some of that logic aside, Mr. Speaker, that is what the Charter of Rights and Freedoms is for.
That's right.
It's to protect the minorities, the vulnerable minorities, from decisions which could be harmful by government. This government is openly acknowledging that they know that this bill will infringe on the rights of children, of vulnerable children, of gender diverse children, of trans children, because the notwithstanding clause is right in there. They're not even going to wait for the courts to tell them that. They also know that this bill is infringing on the Human Rights Code, because that notwithstanding clause is also in there, Mr. Speaker, despite this government in 2015 expanding that code. Mr. Speaker, something has changed since 2015, and they have yet to say what that is, Mr. Speaker. I mean, leaving the Charter of Rights and Freedoms and the Saskatchewan Human Rights Code aside, there's also the UN Convention of the Rights of Children, Mr. Speaker. And I don't know if members opposite heard the Minister of Education yesterday in committee when asked whether or not he believed that this government, this Saskatchewan Party government, is obligated to follow the UN Conventions of the Rights of Children. He said, Mr. Speaker, this government, this Sask Party government, doesn't take orders from the United Nations. Mr. Speaker. Is that the position of this government now? Mr. Speaker, what about UNDRIP?
Yeah, he's nodding.
Does this government understand why the United Nations was even created in the first place? Mr. Speaker, that it was born out of World War II and the genocide, the Holocaust, the murder of Jewish people? Mr. Speaker, does this government understand that now that they don't take orders from the United Nations, Mr. Speaker? I mean, this is a government that has a flag of Israel out in the rotunda right now. If they won't listen to the voices of trans people, if they won't listen to the voices of psychologists, Mr. Speaker, maybe they will listen to this voice. This is coming from a lawyer who lives in Saskatoon. She sent this letter to the Premier and the Justice Minister and CC'd myself. She said, quote, "To Saskatchewan leadership, I write this email as a concerned resident of Saskatchewan, as a Jewish person living with a very real sense of fear and unsafeness. I write this email as a Canadian citizen whose gratitude for the existence of the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms cannot be understated, especially in a time of crisis such as this. As a person who recognizes the fundamental importance of the protection of Charter affords to the most vulnerable. I write this email as a resident of Saskatchewan who's deeply concerned by the Sask Party's blatant subversion of rule of law and the Sask Party's failure to protect its electorate. The horrendous and unspeakable acts of violence in Israel and Palestine this past week are unjustifiable. They have made Jewish people like me feel unsafe in our skin. No person in Saskatchewan, Canada, or the world should ever feel unsafe for being who they are. This includes the Palestinian people living in Gaza and beyond who do not support the terrorist organization Hamas and who have become the victims of unjustifiable violence. The right to feel safe and protected extends to all people, including the children and residents of Saskatchewan. Governments and thereby its elected officials have an obligation, a non-negotiable obligation, to protect its citizens. This obligation extends to protecting the physical, economic, and psychological safety of its citizens. This is not an easy job. It is often a thankless job, but it is a necessary one. A job every single politician signs up for when they are elected to represent their electorate. Bill 137 represents the Saskatchewan government's failure to protect one of its most vulnerable demographics, children. This alone should be enough to convince the Sask Party of the delegitimacy of this bill. If a law begs the question that children may be harmed in the making of it, it is not worth implementing. Full stop. If numerous residents of Canada publicly and directly raise concerns with the safety of Saskatchewan children from the implementation of this legislation, the governing party has an obligation to take this to heart and to adjust its laws accordingly. The concept of parental rights does not exist in law in Saskatchewan or Canada. In stark contrast, the obligation to protect the vulnerable and the obligation to protect children exists both in our civil and criminal law. It is a tenet of our legal system. To suggest otherwise is simply inaccurate. If government enacts legislation that is lawfully determined to violate the rights and protections of Canadian citizens as protected by the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, the law is struck down as unconstitutional. This is the basis of our constitutional democracy. This represents the proper checks and balances we have created in our civil and democratic society. Government doesn't always get it right. The court doesn't always get it right. They communicate with one another. They dialogue. And in doing so, the government and the courts create laws that govern its citizens in the most humane, respectful, and protective manner that adheres to our Constitution. The Sask Party's staunch decision to invoke the notwithstanding clause in the Charter of Rights and Freedoms represents the clearest affront to Canada's civil society. As a resident of Saskatchewan, a citizen of Canada, and a member of a minority group, the use of the notwithstanding clause conveys a message to me and all other minorities that we are dispensable, that we are not worthy of protection, that we particularly are not worthy of the protection afforded by the Charter of Rights and Freedoms. This act says to me, my government does not care about me, It does not protect me. This is the single biggest failing of a government. I am heartbroken to say I am embarrassed and disappointed to be a resident of Saskatchewan. I have always been a proud Saskatchewanian. This is no longer true. I feel immense shame in light of the Sask Party's attempt to pass Bill 137. More importantly, I am scared and anxious. As a citizen of this province, country, and world, that my government is steadfastly invoking the notwithstanding clause. Not only is the Sask Party implementing the improper process to invoke such a clause, doing so directly undermines the most important tenet of our society, the rule of law. If we lose this, we have nothing. Civil society as we know it will crumble. This is not an over-exaggeration. This will have lasting, detrimental, and potentially irreparable impacts on our society. History shows this. I will not be a part of the demise of my beautiful province. I do not want to see civil society as I know it regress. I do not want to see vulnerable communities become fearful to live, but I'm seeing it. And this will only continue with the passage of Bill 137 and the Sask Party invoking the notwithstanding clause. I implore you to see the irreparable harm caused by the Sask Party's intended course of action. I do not support Bill 137. I do not support the use of the notwithstanding clause. I cannot and will not support a political party who proceeds in this fashion. This course of action stands in stark contrast to the obligation of government to protect its citizens. I will never support a government that does not protect its citizens. Do not proceed with Bill 137. Do not invoke the notwithstanding clause. Do not do this to our province. Do not do this to your electorate. End of the letter, Mr. Speaker. I asked this government, who are they going to listen to? None of these voices are enough for them, Mr. Speaker. And again, this was in 8 days from the introduction of the bill. We've had all of these voices speak out, Mr. Speaker. No wonder they didn't want this bill to go through the regular process, Mr. Speaker. No wonder they didn't want this bill to be debated and discussed and consulted on for 6 months, Mr. Speaker. These are powerful messages. And she talks about a concept that hasn't been talked about much during the course of this conversation, during the course of this debate, and that is the rule of law, Mr. Speaker. And I mentioned it on Thursday. I'm going to mention it again. The Premier's decision to use the term judicial overreach, Mr. Speaker, on a decision related to an injunction application, which is a pause on the policy to allow the court to hear arguments on the substantive application, the Premier described as judicial overreach. That is a slap in the face, a shot across the bow to the rule of law. And it is Trump-style politics, plain and simple. You can't call it much else than that. And this province collectively has to and will say no to that kind of divisive politics. They will say no to that shot across the bow, to the rule of law, to the important tenets of our democratic institutions, Mr. Speaker. And like I said before, every single member of the bar who is a Sask Party MLA knows exactly what I'm talking about and should have spoken up.
Yep.
You know, we've talked about it a bit. I want to bring up again, with what little time we have left, or for this government will decide how they're voting on this bill. Before each government MLA must decide how they're voting on this bill. Who else hasn't been consulted? And I think we've talked a lot, and I cannot overemphasize the importance of those in the community, those in the trans community, those in the queer community, and youth in particular, who were left out of this conversation by their Sask Party government, Mr. Speaker. But there are also other implications of this legislation that this government hasn't bothered to look into or consult on, Mr. Speaker. You know, one thing this legislation doesn't really contemplate or talk about is what happens in the case of a family breakdown, Mr. Speaker. Who is a parent pursuant to this legislation, Mr. Speaker? Is it all biological parents? What about parents who haven't been involved in the lives of their child? Do they have equal ability to say yes or no than a parent who has primary custody? What about the mature minor doctrine? That's a very common doctrine, well understood, Mr. Speaker. The Minister of Justice had brought up the fact that consent is required for some medical treatments, for some vaccinations. There is a mature minor exception to that she failed to leave out, Mr. Speaker, and it isn't included in this bill. There is no exception for mature minors pursuant to this legislation, Mr. Speaker. How is that supposed to interplay with the Children's Law Act? Completely silent, no consultation with the family law bar, Mr. Speaker. What about the best interests of the children, Mr. Speaker? What about the best interests of children? That is a understood principle that flows through the legislation that deals with children, be it child apprehension law, family law, you name it. Every piece of legislation except for this one, Mr. Speaker. In the event of a family breakdown, when courts are left to decide what to do, custody and access time, Mr. Speaker, they don't turn to the parents and say, what do you want, what do you want? Okay, we'll pick you. They are obligated, pursuant to law, to look first to the best interests of the children. They take a child-centered approach. Our family law system is designed to take a child-centered approach. Why is this legislation different? Completely silent on that issue, Mr. Speaker. The Minister of Justice has spoken here and spoken in media about the use of the notwithstanding clause, and her and I have been having a bit of a war of quotes, I would say, you know, quoting Alan Blakeney, quoting Peter Lougheed, Mr. Speaker, and she's right. This is unsettled law, Mr. Speaker. There is no clear line that has been determined yet as to when a notwithstanding clause should or should not be used. But I do want government members to know that for the most part, most academics will agree that the notwithstanding clause should be used as a measure of last resort. Mr. Speaker, it is not being used as a measure of last resort here. That it should be used after the judicial process has completely worked its way through. That's not happening here, Mr. Speaker. That it should do as little harm as possible, Mr. Speaker. I don't think that's what's happening here, Mr. Speaker. And many would say that it should be used only to deal with publicly non-controversial issues. Mr. Speaker, I don't think you can get a much more controversial issue than this one, Mr. Speaker. I will admit that. This is a very divisive topic. I think that's exactly why this government has brought it up, Mr. Speaker. And the Minister of Justice will say that the Sask Party government is in good company with using the notwithstanding clause in the way that they have and for the purpose that they have. Mr. Speaker, I implore her to compare apples to apples. Yes, Quebec has used it a lot of times. The context in which they have used it needs to be fully understood and talked about, Mr. Speaker. It was being done as a bit of a protest, I would say, and they were using it for every piece of legislation over a course of time. I mean, is the government implying that that's what they're going to do next? I'm not saying they are, but if we're going to compare apples to apples, let's compare apples to apples. Because this government stands alone in what they're doing now, in terms of using the notwithstanding clause to purposely infringe on the rights of children, Mr. Speaker. Now, there was a time not very long ago where we agreed. We passed consent legislation on using the notwithstanding clause. That was to protect the rights of children to choose which school they wanted to attend, not to infringe on the rights of children, Mr. Speaker. And that bill never had to receive royal assent. Last resort, Mr. Speaker, the Court of Appeal made it so that bill was no longer necessary, Mr. Speaker. So again, I say, for this government, you are making history today. And perhaps some of you are proud of that, but I hope for some of you it gives you pause. Because you are knowingly passing legislation which will infringe on the rights of vulnerable children, Mr. Speaker. And any government worth their salt would at least take pause before they did that, Mr. Speaker. And there are varying level of members on government side who some have been here longer than others, Mr. Speaker, and I will say, you know, there are things that they have done as a government that I'm sure they are proud about, that I'm sure they are proud that they have done for the province of Saskatchewan. And for some, I would say I agree with them. But this vote today, this will be your legacy. Mm-hmm. The rest of it gets washed away because this is what makes history. Yep. This is legacy. Yep. Mr. Speaker. Whatever you've done before this won't matter, Mr. Speaker. That applies to every government MLA, not just every government MLA who votes today, but every MLA who wears the Sask Party banner, Mr. Speaker. And I hope at the very least that gives you pause. If not, the voices that have come to this chamber, this assembly, who's filled this gallery, if that didn't give you pause, if the letters didn't give you pause, if the voices of concern didn't give you pause from all of these organizations, Mr. Speaker, if the rollback of human rights doesn't give you pause, if the deliberate violation of the Charter of Rights and Freedoms of Children don't give you pause, perhaps that legacy will. That's my hope, Mr. Speaker.
Pursuant to the sessional order, debate time has expired. Is it the pleasure of the Assembly to adopt the motion? Aye. All those in favor say yea. Yea. Those opposed say no. No. Calling the members. The question before the Assembly is the motion moved by the Minister that Bill number 137, the Education Parents Bill of Rights Amendment Act 2023 be now read a third time. All those in favor of the motion, please stand.
Yes.
Mr. McMorris?
Yes.
Mr. Hinley?
Yes.
Mr. Ryder?
Yes.
Ms. Harpower?
Yes.
Mr. Duncan?
Yes.
Mr. Merriman?
Yes.
Ms. Tell?
Yes.
Mr. Makowski?
Yes.
Mr. Merritt?
Yes.
Mr. Shovel-Dayoff?
Yes.
Mr. Skorpad?
Yes.
Mr. Kading?
Yes.
Mr. Cockrell?
Yes.
Ms. Ross Regina Rochdale?
Yes.
Ms. Eyre?
Yes.
Mr. Harrison Meadow Lake?
Yes.
Ms. Carr?
Yes.
Mr. Hargrave?
Yes.
Mr. McLeod Moose Jaw North?
Yes.
Mr. Buckingham?
Yes.
Mr. Bradshaw?
Yes.
Mr. Fayez?
Yes.
Mr. Dennis?
Yes.
Mr. Kirsch?
Yes.
Ms. Lambert?
Yes.
Mr. Francis?
Yes.
Ms. Young Lloyd-Minster?
Yes.
Mr. Bonk?
Yes.
Mr. Nerline?
Yes.
Mr. McLeod Lumsden Morris?
Yes.
Mr. Friesen?
Yes.
Mr. Graywall?
Yes.
Mr. Gowdy?
Yes.
Mr. Kiesig?
Yes.
Mr. Lemig?
Yes.
Mr. Jensen?
Yes.
Mr. Harrison Cannington?
Yes.
Mr. Domitar?
Yes.
Ms. Wilson?
Yes.
All those opposed to the motion, please stand.
Ms. Beck?
No.
Ms. Nippy Albright?
No.
Ms. Mowat?
No.
Mr. Witherspoon?
No.
Mr. Love?
No.
Mr. Cheed?
No.
Ms. Young, Regina University?
No.
Mr. Berkey?
No.
Mr. Clark?
No.
Ms. Saar?
No.
Ms. Conway?
No.
Ms. Bose?
No.
Mr. Speaker, those in favor of the motion, 40. Those opposed, 12.
I declare the motion carried.
Third reading of this bill.
I am advised that His Honor the Lieutenant Governor is here for a royal assent. All please rise.
His Honor, the Lieutenant Governor of Saskatchewan.
Pray be seated.
May it please your honor, this legislative assembly in its present session has passed a bill which in the name of the assembly I present to your honor and to which bill I respectfully request your honor's assent.
Your Honor, the bill is as follows. Bill number 137, the Education Parents Bill of Rights Amendment Act 2023.
In His Majesty's name, I assent to this bill.
Please rise for the departure of his honor. Please be seated. I recognize the Government House Leader.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I move that when this Assembly adjourns at the end of this sitting day in accordance with the parliamentary calendar, it shall stand adjourned until 10 a.m. on October 25th, 2023, unless earlier recalled by the Speaker upon the request of the Government.
The Government House Leader moved that when the Assembly adjourns at the end of the sitting day in accordance with parliamentary calendar, it shall stand adjourned until 10 a.m. on October 25th, 2023, unless earlier recalled by the Speaker upon the request of the government. Is it the pleasure of the Assembly to adopt the motion? Carried. Recognize the Government House Leader.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I move that this House do now adjourn.
The Government House Leader has moved to adjourn the House. It is the pleasure of the Assembly to adopt the motion. This House now stands adjourned till Wednesday, October 25th.
Shame on you. Shame.
Order.